I'm Boxflyer, and I'd like to show you some alternate rims available for the BMW R1200 RTW. That's from 2014 through the current models of 2020. First off, I started with an F800 GT rim, and you need to get the ones that have the 5 bosses that can be drilled to accept the small diameter speed ring. This is not the one that fits under the bolts where the rotors attach, but the small version that will fit on top of the 5 bosses that will match up with the speed pickup sensor on our current bikes. Overlay the small speed sensor on the 5 bosses, mark the holes, get your drill set up. It takes a 4.2 diameter drill. That's the standard size for an M5 screw. I put a stop collar on it. I drill to 15 millimeters of depth. That gives me a little extra depth for the tap to use. I use a starting tap, not a bottoming tap. It's a M5 by 0.8 thread, and I use some lubricant to ease the tap in and out. Make sure you break the threads as you go in and out. I cut some standard binding head screws to 10 millimeters long so they don't bottom out in the hole, and they hold the speed ring on versus the real bolts that are supposed to be used for this application. Install them with some blue Loctite, and they'll never come loose. It's a standard small amount of torque, just 7 Newton meters will hold them on, and this speed ring is in the perfect location for the speed pickup that's on the motorcycle right now. Here it is all installed and perfectly aligned. Now you need to replace the 30 by 47 axle seal on the left hand side with a 25 by 47 seal that'll fit the spacer correctly on the current axle. Now we need to put on the front rotors. Get these from a OEM R1200 RT. They're the correct part number right here. Ensure that you mount the rotors the correct way. This is the bottom side that goes against the rim, and next I'll show you the right side up. This is where the bolts go through. Here's the part number. Torque these initially to 10 Newton meters and then to a final setting of 19 Newton meters. Here's a completed wheel assembly, all ready to go. And another one that I had worked on earlier and is all built up, also ready to go onto the bike. Another good choice for rims are from the K53 or K54, the R1200R or RS series. They need to have the bearings, seals, and inner sleeve changed in order to work with our bike. Here's one I found on eBay. It's from the K54 RS. It comes mounted with the speed ring and the rotors. Here you can see that the seals are the wrong size. They're 30 by 47, and we need to change these to be 25 by 47. Both sides are the same at 30 millimeters, so we have to change both side seals and both side bearings as well as the inner sleeve. Here the inner race shows it's 25 millimeters. We need to change that to 20 millimeters. These come in a kit. You can buy both bearings, both seals, all at once. The seals on this one had leaked, and you can see there's water damage to the bearings. I would have replaced these bearings even if I was going to use it on a RS if I found that kind of water intrusion into here. You can see that the lip is not accessible to use a wheel puller, a bearing puller, to get these bearings off. So you have to use a special kind of a split ring puller. This is from Motion Pro. It's a 08-0267, and this is the 25 millimeter size because that's the bearing we're going to remove. If you're going to remove the bearings from your RT, you'd use the 20 millimeter size. Here's the splitter driver tool that wedges open the tool inside the bearing inner race so that it'll grip it and pound it out. Here it's wedged into the tool in the bearing, and the driver rod is sticking out the other side, ready to be whacked with a hammer. So you heat up the rim, expand the metal. It's an interference fit. Make sure you keep it moving. Don't exceed 100 degrees centigrade. Now you can see the splitter tool is all set up, lined up, ready to go. Just hit the driver rod with a really strong hammer and drives out the bearing, the inner sleeve. They all come out onto the workbench. Now you can see through the inner race, the inner part of the rim, and see the race on the other side. You pull the splitter tool out of the old bearing, put it in from the inside area of the wheel, and you don't have to use the splitter tool itself this time. You just drive the back side of the 25 millimeter tool. The shoulder then pushes on the inner race and drives it out. Once again, though, you have to heat up the metal around the rim. to allow this to slide out. 100 degrees centigrade is the maximum you should ever achieve. And at this time, you can just use a regular rod, some kind of a drift, to hammer on the 25 millimeter splitter tool, and it'll drive out the bearing from the inside. It doesn't require anything other than just some kind of a drift or a rod. And you just hit it a few times, and it drops right out of the wheel onto the workbench. And then you just remove the 25 millimeter splitter tool, and your wheel is stripped. It doesn't have any bearings, seals, or sleeve on the inside. You can see that the bearing sits flush on the side with the speed ring, and on the opposite side, there's a slight offset. The bearing does not sit all the way against the shoulder. This is what is used to establish the space for the speed pickup on the fork of your bike. So just keep track of which side has to have some offset space allowance for establishing where the rim is centered in the axle.
Okay, now I've got the inside of the wheel so that I can access this area where the shoulder of the bearing has to seat, and it's got some corrosion and rust in there from the water intrusion we saw earlier. So I'm just going to use some 4/0 steel wool and clean off this area just a little bit so that the new bearing, the edge of the new bearing, sits like it's supposed to. This is the side that actually has some offset space to it, so it's not going to sit down tight against the shoulder right here. So that's good enough. Now on the other side, this side needs to be cleaned so that the bearing
shoulder does sit down flush when you use the correct driving tool to drive it into the rim.
To put the bearing in properly in the access for the wheel, you need to have some kind of an alignment tool that holds the bearing in proper alignment while you drive it into the rim itself. This is a Motion Pro 08-0551, and it comes with all of the correct inserts for the bearings that we have. It has a handle and a cap screw to hold things together. The bearings we need have a 47 millimeter exterior diameter and a 20 millimeter interior race diameter. So you put the 20 millimeter cone in the 47 millimeter, you put the cap screw in, and simply screw on the handle. And now the 20 millimeter internal race aligns the bearing properly, and the 47 millimeter has a little ring around it, and it only puts pressure on the outside race as it drives into the wheel. It doesn't transmit any power, any force through the roller bearings themselves to do any damage.
I have the bearings in the freezer to get them to shrink down a little bit before trying to install them into the rim. Now I'm going to heat up the rim so I can seat the bearing with as little effort as possible.
Just need to keep this moving so you don't burn the paint on the rim. We're just trying to expand the area where the bearing is going to sit into. You don't have to go very far out, just the area where the bearing is going to slide in the interference fit. There's a lot of metal here, taking the heat away very, very rapidly. I've got my thermal gun on here, and it reads that temperature is about 200 degrees all the way around here. It's taken me about 5 or 6 minutes to get this temperature up to 200 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and try it with this 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and the bearing has come straight out of the freezer where it said it was 32 degrees in my freezer. So just going to put it on the mandrel, and I put a little bit of oil down the sleeve before, and just going to, and you can distinctly hear the difference in sound when the bearing seats all the way to the bottom. It has a very, very sharp metallic sound instead of a dull thud as you're driving it in. So now it's completely seated. The bearing driving tool put all the pressure on the outer race and none on the inner race or the bearings. This turns easily and smoothly. There's no damage to anything here. And now I can go flip it over and do the same thing on the other side.
Warning, in the next part of the video, I replaced the original 25mm ID spacer from the R1200 RS. That can't be used, so you need to replace it with one of the OEM spacers from the RT itself.
First, we're going to put in the sleeve, the spacer sleeve, to establish the location of where the new bearing, the other side bearing, is going to go. And you can see this is ever so slightly above the edge of the shoulder, where the so that the shoulder of the bearing does not sit flush against the outer race. It sits flush on the inner race, and that's as far as you go.
I think it's a little more important to heat this side up to the 100 degrees centigrade as specified in the manual, so that the bearing slides in as easily as possible. When you put the mandrel on it to drive the bearing in, you want it to just seat with the inner race on the sleeve, and that establishes the correct distance for the offset on this side. I put a little bit of oil around the machined surface and a little bit on the outside of the bearing, and I'm going to put it in here and now just drive it in with a hammer.
There, and you can hear the sound again, and it's touched the inner sleeve. That's hot. So the inner sleeve is now sandwiched evenly. That's hot on this side still. Yes, it's hot. So after this has been completely driven in and you think it's flush with the inner sleeve, make sure that the sleeve is not in a bind. This is not too tight that the inner race can't move freely just with your finger. It's still hot, and the other side turns freely as well. So the sleeve on the inside is positioned where it's supposed to be, but it's not pushing excessively on the race, the inner race of the bearing. The next thing we're going to do is install a seal, and this is the 25 by 47. This says it's only 6 millimeters thick, but the original one is 7 millimeters, but that fits fine. So I'm going to drive this in, and when I get done driving it in, I'm going to fill the void, this whole space that is inside where the bearing seal is, where we saw all the rust before from water getting in here. I'm going to fill this void with waterproof grease, high pressure wheel bearing waterproof grease that's in this little squirt gun. Using the driving tool one more time with exactly the 20 millimeter inner sleeve and the 47 outer, this will put all the pressure on the outer sleeve of the seal, and the inner 20 millimeter will guide down the inner side, the inner race of the bearing, and keep this all aligned properly so that it goes in square and true. And now I'm going to fill this whole void up inside here with this high pressure grease. Just going to go all the way around and fill that in so that that space won't be subjected to water and rust getting in there. I used a regular Sharpie to write the word offset on here so that I would remember which side of the wheel actually needed to keep the space for the bearing. And Sharpies come off very easily with 91% alcohol, isopropyl alcohol. So when I write on the rims with Sharpie, or write on anything with a Sharpie, it's easily removed with some isopropyl alcohol and doesn't leave any residue. Now I'm going to drive the second seal into the other side. I've turned it over, and this is the speed ring side, and it's the same size bearing as on the other side, so it's an identical procedure to drive it in. And it comes down just flush with the edge of the wheel too. And just like on the other side, I take my little pin grease gun, miniature grease gun, and fill this area all the way around between the seal and the bearing with waterproof grease so that it'll stop any rust from occurring down in there. About the last thing we need to do to complete the assembly of the built-up rim is to install a new tire pressure monitor sender. And so I have a new shear bolt. This is made of aluminum, and it goes into the magnesium alloy wheel, or the alloy wheel, whatever the alloy is. And you have a TPMS sender. And in a later video, I'm going to show you how to trigger this and determine the serial number that's transmitted from this sender that your bike needs to receive. I'll show that on another video, how I do that with the GS911. So just going to take a little blue Loctite, put it on the threads, and I've looked high and low for the torque setting for this, and I don't know what it is. So it doesn't get tightened very much at all. It's just snug, and I don't want to shear it off by tightening it too much. And it just takes a T40 driver to put it in here. Just line it up straight. And I would say that it's around 10 or 12 Newton meters. It's not very much at all. And that's it for the completion of the built-up rim. This is from a R1200 RS, and so it's ready to go on the bike right now.
As soon as I mount a tire. Choices for rear rims are much easier. I prefer the ones that look the same, whether they might be a dark gray or silver. They come off the K52, which is a standard RT, or K53 or K54, which are the R or RS models. They are 5.5 inches wide on the rim and fit in the fender well, and the fender just fine. No clearance problems with the swing arm whatsoever. The other ones that are slightly wider are from the K40 or K43, the K1200 or K1300S. Here's part of my collection of TPMSs. The ones with the bolt holes through the middle of them go on the rims that have the spoke-mounted inflation valve, and the ones that have the stem attached to it go on rims that have a hole in the center line of the rim. Here's the part number and all the models of the BMW that use this part, the one with the bolt hole through it and the spoke-mounted inflation valve.